The boy sat outside the hospital gate every night, no jacket, no bag, just silence and shaking hands. Most people looked away, but one guard didn't. Frank took off his own jacket and wrapped it around the boy's shoulders. "No one should freeze alone," he said. You won't believe what happened next. The next morning, military SUVs surrounded the parking lot, and a decorated colonel stepped out. "Who gave my son that jacket?" he asked, voice tight. If you believe quiet kindness still matters, hit like and comment respect below. And to see how one small act changed everything, subscribe to Graceful Valor Stories. Frank Mendes had walked the same sidewalk for years. Every night at 6:45, just before the start of his hospital security shift, he'd grab a stale coffee from the gas station across the street and stroll toward the employee entrance. But recently something had changed. A boy had started sitting by the curb near the parking gate, same spot every evening, skinny frame, torn hoodie, no coat. He never spoke, never asked for anything, just sat there, arms wrapped around his knees, eyes fixed on the sidewalk. Frank noticed him the first night because of how still he was, not the kind of stillness that comes from peace, but the kind that comes from cold. Most folks walked past him like he wasn't there. A few looked down, then away. Nurses, techs, doctors, they had their own burdens. Frank didn't blame them, but it stuck with him, maybe because he'd been there once, too, not homeless, but invisible. The third night in a row, Frank brought 2 coffees from the gas station, one black, one with cream. He sat down on the curb beside the boy, didn't say a word, and placed the cup beside him. The boy didn't touch it, but he didn't run either. The next night, Frank tried again. This time, he added a wrapped sandwich, still nothing. But the night after that, the cup was gone. When Frank returned to his post, it wasn't much, just small signs. Then the temperature dropped, wind sharp enough to cut through fabric. Frank stepped outside during break, looked at the boy, shivering, head down. Without thinking, Frank took off his jacket, faded blue, worn cuffs, the same one he'd worn for years. He crossed the street, knelt beside the boy, and quietly draped it over his shoulders. "No one should freeze alone," he said, voice low. The boy didn't answer. He just looked up, eyes wide, a little scared, a little grateful, and held the jacket tight. Frank didn't expect a thank you. He didn't even expect the boy to come back. But the next morning, everything changed. Frank wasn't the kind of man who needed much. His apartment was small but tidy, no framed medals, no trophies, just a recliner, an old TV, and a shelf of mystery novels with dog-eared pages. He'd worked factory jobs most of his life, steel mill, warehouse, forklift operator, until his back gave out. Now at 58, he worked nights as a hospital security guard. The job didn't pay much, but it was quiet. He liked quiet. Each shift was the same: make rounds, check side doors, wave to the nurses, nod to the janitors. Some of the younger guards thought Frank was too soft. He'd get teased for handing out snacks to patients waiting alone or helping lost families find their way, but Frank didn't mind. He'd learned a long time ago that kindness didn't cost anything, and people remembered it more than you thought. His late wife, Rosa, used to say he had an old soul. She'd been gone 7 years now, but he still made 2 cups of coffee each morning. Habit, memory, maybe both. That morning, as Frank hung up his security vest and rubbed the ache in his lower back, he thought about the boy, wondered if he'd come back, wondered where he'd gone after taking the jacket. He hoped the kid had found a shelter, maybe gotten some food in his belly. Frank didn't tell anyone about the jacket, not his coworkers, not the front desk nurse, not even the guy at the gas station who noticed Frank wasn't wearing his usual coat anymore. He figured the moment had passed. One kind act, one cold night, the world would keep spinning. But as Frank stepped outside to head home, he noticed something strange. 4 large black SUVs lined up near the employee entrance. That never happened here. The engines were off, but men in uniform stood near each one in clean boots, straight backs, no nonsense, military, that much was clear. One of the nurses poked her head out the door, whispered, "Is there a drill or something?" Frank stood frozen. He didn't know why, but his gut told him this was about the boy. And then one of the SUV doors opened. The rear door of the lead SUV swung open with quiet weight, like it had done that 1,000 times before. Out stepped a tall man in full military dress uniform, pressed slacks, polished shoes, ribbons lined neatly across his chest. He looked like he didn't just command a room, he owned it. Heads turned. Someone from the admin office whispered, "Is that a general?" Frank didn't move, he just watched, heart suddenly thumping harder than it should have. The man scanned the parking lot, eyes sharp, then he walked straight toward the hospital entrance, and stopped in front of Frank. "You're the one who gave my son a jacket last night?" the man asked. His voice was steady, but it carried weight, like every word had been trained to land with precision. Frank blinked. Your son?" The man gave a single nod. "Teen boy, thin, silent, sat by the curb. That was your coat, wasn't it?" Frank hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I saw he didn't have one, it was cold." For a moment, the man didn't say anything, then he let out a breath. "I'm Colonel Jacob Barrett, that boy is Caleb, my son." Frank's stomach dropped, not because he'd done anything wrong, but because suddenly everything felt very real. Colonel Barrett gestured to the SUV. He showed up at our base gate last night wearing that jacket, first time we'd seen him in months. Frank swallowed hard. Is he okay? He is now. He asked for help, asked for you, actually. Me? Colonel Barrett's expression softened just a little. You're the first person he's trusted enough to speak to. I don't know what you said or didn't say, but he told us someone finally looked at him like a person, not a problem, not a disappointment. Frank didn't know what to do with it. He wasn't used to being thanked. The colonel nodded once more. He's inside, asked if you'd come sit with him. Frank looked toward the hospital doors, then back at the man, and without saying a word, he followed him in. The hospital room was quiet, not sterile like the others, just quiet, a soft beep from a heart monitor, the low hum of the vent above. Caleb sat on the edge of the bed, back against the wall, wrapped in a clean sweatshirt now, but Frank's jacket was still there, folded beside him like it meant more than warmth. He looked up when they entered, didn't speak, just nodded at Frank, not shy, more like someone who didn't waste words on things that didn't matter. Frank sat down in the chair beside the bed, slow, careful, like he was afraid to break whatever this was. Colonel Barrett stayed near the door, arms folded. Frank glanced at him. You said he'd been gone a while. The colonel nodded. After his mother passed, he started pulling away. I was deployed at the time, missed a lot, more than I should have. Frank didn't pry. The colonel continued, quieter now. He ran away 6 months ago, no note, no trace, just gone. Caleb looked down at his hands. He's been through things I didn't see coming, the colonel added. I thought I could fix it with structure rules. Turns out what he needed was someone who didn't try to fix him at all. Frank stayed silent. He looked over at Caleb and said softly, didn't need to say anything, you looked cold, that was all. Caleb shrugged, barely visible, no one else saw me. You weren't invisible, Frank said gently, not to me. The room went still again. Colonel Barrett stepped forward, voice quiet. You don't know what that moment meant to us, to me. You reached him when I couldn't. Frank shook his head. I didn't do anything special, just handed over a jacket. The colonel's jaw tightened like he was holding something back. In my world, that kind of act is special. Frank looked back at Caleb, who was now watching him more closely, not guarded anymore, just open, and for the first time since they'd met, the boy said something real. Will you come back tomorrow? Frank showed up the next day, and the day after that. No one told him to, no one expected it, but every evening after his shift, he'd stop by Caleb's room with something small in his pocket, a crossword puzzle, a granola bar, an old baseball card from his own childhood. Never big things, just little pieces of connection. Caleb didn't talk much, but he didn't shut down either. They'd sit in silence, sometimes for 30 minutes straight, other times, they'd talk about meaningless things, the best hospital food item, still terrible, the loud nurse on the night shift, the way the vending machine always ate your dollar on Tuesdays, and somehow in that stillness, something started to change. Frank never asked Caleb why he ran away. He didn't need to. Pain had a way of showing itself without words. One night as they sat watching a muted TV, Caleb asked, why did you give me your jacket? Frank thought for a moment, then said, because I've been cold before, and I know what it feels like when no one sees you. Caleb nodded slowly, his eyes on the floor. People always try to fix me, like I'm broken. Frank smiled gently. You're not broken, you're just bruised. Bruises heal, sometimes it just takes longer. The next day, Colonel Barrett pulled Frank aside in the hallway. He's asking for you now, the colonel said, almost amazed. Not me, not the doctors, you. Frank shifted uncomfortably. I'm not trained in this stuff. You're human, that's enough, the colonel replied. Then he paused. You know, we've spent thousands on counselors, specialists, therapists, none of them could get him to open up, but he asked you to bring another crossword today. Frank smiled faintly. He's starting to complain when I get the clues wrong. The colonel chuckled. He's coming back piece by piece. Frank looked down the hallway toward Caleb's room. He's not the only one. On Friday afternoon, Frank was getting ready to leave the hospital when Colonel Barrett caught him near the exit. We're discharging Caleb tomorrow, he said. He's well enough now, we're taking him back to the base for a bit, rebuild things slowly. Frank nodded. That's good, he's stronger than he looks. He'd like you to come, the colonel added. Frank raised an eyebrow. To the base? The colonel gave a small smile. We're holding a small welcome event, nothing fancy, just some people he trusts. He asked for you. Frank hesitated. I've never stepped foot on a military base, I'm not military. You don't have to be, the colonel said, voice calm. You were there when it counted, that's more than I can say for some who are military. The next morning, Frank ironed the only decent shirt he owned and rode the city bus out to the base. As the gates opened and the guard waved him through, he felt wildly out of place. Everything was crisp, orderly, unfamiliar, but then he saw Caleb standing a little taller, wearing clean clothes and a quiet smile. The colonel introduced Frank to a few men from his unit, a few officers, a chaplain, someone from the base youth support team. When Caleb walked up and handed Frank a small pin, just a simple bronze emblem with the words "Honor and Silence," Frank blinked, unsure what to say. Caleb looked up and whispered, "You didn't have to help me, but you did. I won't forget it." Frank's voice caught in his throat. "You don't owe me anything, son." "Maybe not," the colonel said behind him, "but we do." Later, as they stood in the mess hall with others, Frank watched Caleb laugh with a young staff sergeant. It was the first time he'd seen him truly smile, and for the first time in years, Frank felt something stir in his chest, not pride, not relief, something simpler, like he finally belonged somewhere again. Weeks passed. Caleb didn't go back to school right away, but he started meeting with a small youth group on the base, kids like him, who had been through things people didn't talk about. Frank wasn't part of the staff, wasn't trained in trauma or therapy, but somehow he kept being invited back. At first, he just sat in the corner drinking his coffee quietly, but the teens started nodding at him when they walked in. A few even asked if he had any new crossword puzzles, and when Caleb would glance over during the sessions, Frank would give him a small thumbs up. Nothing loud, nothing big, just a quiet reminder that he was there. One Saturday morning, Colonel Barrett found Frank wiping down folding chairs after a session. "You ever think about doing this more often?" he asked. Frank shrugged. "I'm no expert." "You're not supposed to be," the colonel said. "You show up, that's what matters." Later that week, Caleb handed Frank a folded piece of paper. Inside was a drawing, pencil sketched, a little rough around the edges, of a man sitting on a bench in the snow, his jacket draped over a thin boy's shoulders. Frank blinked slowly, running his finger along the lines. "You drew this?" Caleb nodded. "It's us that night." Frank didn't speak, he couldn't, but he slipped the drawing into his wallet, folded carefully behind his ID where it would stay. A few days later, Frank brought something with him to the group, an old dented silver thermos. He held it out to Caleb. "What's this?" Caleb asked. "Had it since 1991, kept it through layoffs, cold nights, hospital shifts, always gave me something warm to carry," Frank said, then added, "Thought maybe it's your turn now." Caleb didn't say a word, he just stood up and hugged Frank, not a quick, awkward one, but a real one, the kind that speaks louder than anything else ever could. Months passed. Frank still worked the night shift at the hospital, same parking lot, same routine, but something inside him had shifted. He didn't bring it up to anyone, but every Sunday morning after his shift, he'd take the bus to the base, not out of obligation, just because he wanted to be there. He'd help set up chairs for the youth group, refill the snack table, hand out crossword puzzles to the kids who asked. He didn't talk much, but he was always there. One morning, Frank arrived to find a new framed photo hanging in the entryway of the group's meeting room. It was a candid shot, Frank sitting on a bench, Caleb beside him, both of them looking ahead at something unseen. Beneath it, in small, simple words, he saw what others missed. Frank stared at it for a long time, then quietly took his usual seat near the back. He never asked who put it there. Back at the hospital, things were the same and different. Nurses still clocked in late, vending machines still jammed, and the security booth still smelled like old coffee. But sometimes Frank would spot someone on the curb, a new face, a tired one, or just someone lost in the noise of the world. And on cold nights, he kept a folded jacket in his locker, just in case. He never expected thanks. That wasn't why he did it, because Frank had learned something that winter, kindness doesn't have to be loud. You don't need a title to make a difference, and sometimes the smallest acts echo far beyond what we'll ever know. If you believe quiet kindness can still change a life, hit like, comment, respect below, and share this story with someone who still believes in good. Subscribe to Graceful Valor Stories for more stories that prove humanity still shines.